The film starts with a psychiatrist explaining Operation MKUltra, which was conducted by the CIA in the 1960s. In this secret operation, they used drugs like LSD to control the minds of civilians across many hospitals in the country. They also had secret hideouts known as black sites, where they would perform the experiments without any sort of supervision, but generally they recruited doctors and professors for their operations. One doctor on their radar is a psychiatrist named Ford, who works in a mental institution in Mississippi. It's 1961, and Ford hates barbaric methods like shock therapy, which are used to treat psychological conditions. His disdain for his job is taking a toll on his health, and he uses marijuana to calm his nerves. His wife Rose is very supportive of his work, and she often tells him that things will be alright, but Ford doesn't have much faith in the system. During a board meeting, he proposes to conduct a study to see if instead of physical trauma, they can use hallucinogenic drugs to treat mental conditions, but the board refuses to fund his research after a senior psychiatrist named Dr. Miller says that it will be a waste of time and precious funds. While Ford is thinking about what to do next, CIA agent Morgan is busy giving some drugs to a prostitute. He's trying to get intimate with her when he receives a call from his superior who asks him to recruit Ford into the MKUltra project. The next day, Ford goes to his office to find the parents of a patient named Brian. Brian was brought here after he butchered some pigs, and Ford tells his parents that Brian has a disability but he can still live a normal life. However, Brian's father wants him to stay in the hospital until he's completely fit. Because of this, Ford refers Brian to Dr. Miller, but he isn't happy about this decision, and he smashes his briefcase in the railing to let off some steam after leaving the hospital. He's walking to his car when Morgan approaches him and asks him to get in his car after showing his badge. He takes Ford to a brothel, which has become a hotspot for many drug addicts. This is when Morgan explains that he works for the government and he wants to fund Ford's research. In return for this funding, he wants Ford to share all of his findings with him so that the government can find a way to help the people who are struggling with psychological problems. Ford doesn't know how to respond to this offer, and he just grabs Morgan's card and goes back home. At night, he's thinking about the offer, and Rose can see that he's stressed. So she takes him to the bedroom, and after tying him to the bed, she tries to pleasure him, but Ford is having trouble getting aroused. Rose starts crying after thinking that she's not good enough to please her husband, but Ford assures her that he's just stressed about Morgan's shady-looking offer. The next morning, another CIA agent named Townsend is retrieving a runaway test subject from a park. While he's pushing the naked guy into his car, Ford is looking for Brian. And after learning that Miller is getting ready to lobotomize Brian, he is mad. He doesn't want Brian's life to get ruined in the name of science, but he has no authority to stop Miller. With no other option in sight, Ford immediately calls Morgan and agrees to work for him if he can stop Miller from lobotomizing his patient. Morgan really wants to recruit Ford, so he calls Miller and orders him to stop operating on Brian immediately. Even though Ford managed to save his patient, he doesn't have much time to celebrate because the very next day, Townsend picks him up from his house and drives him to an unknown location after blindfolding him. Ford eventually finds himself sitting in front of Agent Dwyer, who will be administering a lie detector test on him. During the test, Dwyer asks Ford questions about his political aspirations as well as about any hidden addictions or debts. After Ford answers these questions, Dwyer pulls a prank on him before telling him that he's been cleared to work with them. But before he's officially hired, Morgan wants him to sign an NDA which forbids Ford from telling anyone about the involvement of the CIA in his research. Ford complies with this condition, and after he signs the papers, Townsend gives him a suitcase full of hallucinogens. After accepting this, Ford is ready to begin his research. So while the CIA is running ads about the success of MKUltra, Ford is busy recruiting patients for his study. His first interesting patient is an arsonist named Shelley, who killed her parents by setting her house on fire. He also recruits an addict named Wallace. His third candidate is Laura, who was arrested for being transgender. She agrees to be part of Ford's study if she can live in the female ward. The head nurse Irwin is against this idea, but Ford asks her to leave the room and then offers to give Laura her own room if she joins the study. After recruiting Laura, Ford's fourth and final candidate is Brian, who gives him a hug for saving him from a lobotomy. And with this, Ford's study has officially begun. That afternoon, Townsend leaves with all the data Ford has collected so far. Meanwhile, Ford grabs some weed from the suitcase and goes home to smoke it. He's thinking about a video in which they explain how LSD is obtained from a fungus. They also show how it affects the midbrain and takes over the sensory function to show people some really creepy and weird visions. The drug isn't really addictive, but it's extremely potent, and this is why the government is experimenting with it. The next morning, Townsend once again sets up his portable camera while Ford asks Irwin to give 400 milligrams of LSD to all 4 test subjects. Townsend thinks that it's a really heavy dose, but Ford wants quick results. After the patients take the tablets, Ford waits eagerly for the effects, and he doesn't have to wait long because pretty soon Shelley starts experiencing extreme perspiration. While she's taking off her hospital uniform to cool down, Brian is conversing and getting really paranoid. After asking Irwin to give Brian the antidote, Ford walks over to check on Laura, who seems to be praying. So far, only Wallace seems to be unaffected by the LSD, and he is angrily asking Ford to give him some drugs because he's having a withdrawal. The results of this first session have been dramatic, and Ford believes they are going to last at least 8 hours. At the end of the day, he goes to Miller's office to pick up Brian's case file, and this is when he learns that Miller has been fired. Ford apologizes to him, but Miller says it's not his fault, and he even offers Ford a drink. While they're drinking, he advises Ford to be cautious of the people who are sponsoring his study, because they might have ulterior motives. He ends the conversation after reminding Ford of his oath as a doctor to never hurt his patients. Miller's words perplex Ford, and the next day he asks Townsend where his research is being taken, but Townsend tells him to call Morgan if he wants to ask anything. He then grabs all the footage and transcripts and goes to the brothel, which has been turned into a CIA black site. Inside, Dwyer is torturing another test subject, and Townsend sits down to enjoy the show. While he's busy watching this brutality, his boss Morgan is in a prison where the guards are using hypnosis to force a German inmate to stab a dummy. Morgan's fascinated by the results, and he calls Townsend to see if his operation is going smoothly. Townsend tells him that Ford wants to see him, but Morgan asks him just to keep Ford occupied with work. This is exactly what Townsend does, and a few weeks later he is recording another session where Ford is showing Shelley a lighter to see her response. Under the influence of LSD, she tells him that she likes him, and then she starts pleasing herself in front of him. She wants him to make love to her, but Ford is clearly not interested, and this is what makes her mad. Eventually, Ford leaves her behind and administers some drugs into Brian's body. The guy immediately starts panicking, and Ford puts a mask on his head to calm him down. He asks Brian about his visions and learns that he is scared of the animals on his dad's farm. The poor guy is so freaked out that he starts screaming. The results of Ford's study are really different from the sanitized ads that the government has been showing to the public. And things get even crazier when Ford tries to interview Wallace, who is experiencing withdrawal sickness. Ford explains that drugs have ruined his life and given him nothing in return, but his words only make Wallace mad, and he ends up stabbing Ford in the neck. Ford survives the attack, but he needs stitches for the cuts on his neck. Irwin asks him to take some rest, but he knows that Laura has taken LSD and he really wants to conduct an interview with her. But before he goes into her room, he tells Townsend that Wallace will be removed from the study since he's too violent. So far, Shelley and Brian have responded well to this therapy, but Ford hasn't seen any positive results from Laura. He tries to ask some questions about her family, and she tells him that her parents always supported her decision to be a girl. She even believes that God will forgive her for what she has done. She's opening up to him when suddenly she notices Morgan behind the window and starts praying frantically. Ford leaves the room to meet Morgan, who's there to see how things are going. Ford tries to ask him what he's doing with all this data, but Morgan makes it clear that if Ford wants more funding from the government, he can't ask about anything. However, he is impressed with the results and is really interested in Laura. That evening, Ford is finding it hard to fall asleep because he keeps thinking about Laura. Rose asks him what's wrong, and he tells her that he doesn't know why Laura isn't responding to the therapy. He's also a little stressed since he has already lost a test subject in his study, which means his research will not be academically credible anymore. Rose suggests that if he is not content with what he's doing, he should stop. The next day, Ford's thinking about this when he goes to work, but there he learns that Laura has been taken away by the government. He tries to call Morgan, but Townsend stops him and explains that they have taken Laura away and Ford won't be seeing her again. This is unacceptable for Ford, and he threatens to quit if Laura's not brought back to the hospital. But Townsend tells him he has no choice but to continue his study if he doesn't want to face some serious consequences. So for the next 2 weeks, Ford continues studying his remaining 2 subjects. He's getting more and more stressed and doesn't know what to do. While he's finding it hard to carry on, the CIA is telling people that they are using prostitutes to get information from high-ranked officials. In fact, Morgan is using Laura for this very purpose. But Ford doesn't know about this, and he's still trying to treat Shelley and Brian, who are showing progress. Then one night, as Townsend leaves with all the data, Ford follows him to the brothel. After Townsend goes in, Ford notices a man dragging Laura into the building. He immediately runs after them and even shouts Laura's name, but no one responds. So he goes back to his car and waits for Townsend to leave. He then sneaks into the building where he sees people getting tortured. He's horrified, but remains calm and grabs as many film rolls as he can before running out. However, he drops something behind and Morgan realizes that someone has stolen their data. That night, Ford goes to his office and uses a projector to look at all the footage. He can see how they experimented on soldiers and even used Laura in their heinous activities. Ford's disgusted by all these inhuman experiments, and the next morning he grabs a gun from his cupboard before leaving for work. From his office, he tries to call the police, but he knows that cops can't help him. While he is thinking about what to do next, Morgan's superior informs him that Ford knows too much about their operation and that they need to shut it down. So Morgan goes back to the prison to meet the German prisoner once again. That evening, Ford is watching TV when Irwin calls him and explains how a fire has destroyed everything in his office. She claims that Shelley somehow escaped from her cell and lit herself on fire inside the office, but Ford knows that this is just a cover-up. He goes to the hospital where the doctors are operating to save Shelley's life. After the surgery, Ford goes to talk to her. He tells her that he knows that she didn't start the fire, and he even apologizes for dragging her into this mess. Shelley is badly injured. Still, she manages to share that the cameraman is the one who started the fire. Ford knows who she means by the cameraman, and he once again drives to the brothel. He's extremely mad, and with a gun in his hand, he walks into the building. Inside, he finds Townsend, who at first tries to stop Ford, but then just apologizes for everything he's done before falling to his knees. Ford shoots him in the head and turns around to hear Laura screaming for help. He can see the German prisoner stabbing her, and he hits the guy in the head with a camera. The prisoner attacks him, but Ford slices his throat with his own knife. He wants to check up on Laura, but just then Morgan walks into the room, and Ford shoots him as well. However, Morgan manages to stab him in the stomach before collapsing. Ford is in pain, but he knows he has to finish the job, so he grabs a wooden clock and beats Morgan to death with it. He then goes up to Laura, but she is already bled out by that point. Years later, Ford thinks about all of this as his biography is being written. But while he managed to stand up against this brutality, many other doctors failed to raise their voices. In fact, dozens of doctors even lied about MKUltra to a Senate committee in 1977 because their CIA handlers threatened them. However, according to a news report from the same year, the project failed to come up with a mind control technique even after conducting such inhumane experiments. If you enjoyed that recap, I got a good feeling you'll enjoy this one too. Click on the video on your screen for more.